This program is made possible in part by the Maryland Arts Council through the State of Maryland and the National Endowment for the Arts and the Howard County Arts Council through a grant from Howard County government.
Hello, and welcome to Hoco Palizzo's The Writing Life. I'm Ron Charles, the fiction critic for the Washington Post. My guest today is the celebrated writer Alice McDermott. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Ron.
Alice McDermott was born in Brooklyn in 1953 and lived most of her life in Long Island, most of her childhood in Long Island. She was an undergraduate at the State University of New York and earned a master's degree in writing at the University of New Hampshire. Her 6 novels include Charming Billy, which won the National Book Award, along with After This, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. She now teaches writing at Johns Hopkins University and lives with her family in Bethesda. I understand you didn't grow up expecting to be a professional writer, or even conceiving of that as a possible profession. When did you first start to think that was something you could do?
Well, I mean, I always read, and I knew there were writers out there.
Right.
I figured they were dead white males.
They were mostly, I suppose.
and they were, and my teachers reassured me of that fact through most of my education. But I also always wrote, and it seems to me, having now raised 3 children of my own, that what children always do isn't necessarily an indication if that's what they're actually good at.
Right.
You know? It's for a child to write is a way of taking control of the world, and somehow you draw pictures, you tell stories, you write.
Right.
But so writing for me was the way in a patriarchal Irish Catholic family with 2 older brothers who were very vocal and continued to be very vocal about everything I did. This was my quiet way of
This is a diary?
Stories.
Oh, really?
Novels. I did have a diary that I called a dream diary that I didn't actually have any of those dreams. They were all made up. But and I did imagine someday somebody would find this diary and be just amazed at the remarkable dreams that I'd had, though I didn't have them. So that fiction writer thing, I guess, was there early. But it really wasn't until I got to college and took a English course,
Yes.
because writing was not something practical to study
Right.
at college. I took an English course called The Nature of Nonfiction, and the first assignment was to write an autobiographical essay, which I went off and did. And of course, nothing that I wrote had actually happened.
You just made this up?
I just made up
in your
a story.
nonfiction class?
Yeah, from my nonfiction class. It would have been very dull for me to write something that had actually happened to me. So I wrote a first-person essay about something that didn't actually happen to me. Brought it to the professor, whose name was Paul Briand, was a journalist and a retired Air Force colonel who was teaching at Oswego State. And he had this wonderful way of teaching. He was all into audiovisual, which was high tech in those days.
Yes.
And so he would make use the overhead projector, and
The whole class would look at your
the
story?
whole class would see your writing on
Wasn't that
a
kind of
huge movie screen. It
intimidating?
was tremendously intimidating, and it very quickly made you consider where you were putting your periods and your commas and what words you were using, because it was right there.
Yeah.
And then he would not invite the students to comment.
No.
He didn't want to hear from us, but he would spend 15, 20 minutes simply looking at every word you had written and ask why it was there and cross it out,
With one of
up
those
on the
wax
screen.
pens?
Yes, with a wax pen. So he did that to my little essay, and then when he was finished speaking about it, he turned to me and said, "McDermott, I want to see you after class." So I figured it was, nonfiction.
The gig was up.
The gate was right. So I went down to the front of this big theater-like classroom as everybody else was going out, and he looked at me and said, "I got bad news for you, kid. You're a writer,
Oh, nice.
and you'll never shake it." And that was the first little glimmer I had, because it was what a good teacher does. He told me what I knew, but I wouldn't have known if he hadn't told me.
And you started writing short stories professionally. You placed them in magazines?
Yes.
Some big
yes.
magazines.
Yes,
Right?
yeah.
Ms., right?
That was my first
Right.
publication, in graduate school.
We don't think of you as a short story writer, though. You made the switch pretty quickly to novels, right? Began writing A Bigamist Daughter?
Yes, yeah.
What gave you the courage to think you could write and publish, a novel?
I still don't have that courage. I'm still waiting for that courage to arrive. I think a mistake a lot of young writers make is that I'll write short stories and then I'll make the stories a little bit longer, and then they'll eventually get a little bit longer, and eventually I'll be a novelist.
Right.
I learned, as most of us do learn by doing, that's not necessarily the case. I had been writing short stories and publishing a few, and then I sort of arranged my life. I'd finished with graduate school, and I was recently married, and my husband and I pooled our wedding money, and said that he was still in graduate school. We had subsidized housing for graduate students, that I could mostly write for 6 months. And not actually get a job.
Afford.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
okay.
but not have to really have a job.
Right.
And when it was the first time in my life I had that much time when I was supposed to actually be writing. And that's when I realized, well, I can't finish a story Tuesday night and start a new story Wednesday morning. Everybody has to write a first novel, not counting the ones I wrote as a child. And so I thought, with this much time, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to have to at least make a stab at my first novel.
So in this financial crunch, you decided, I'll write a novel.
Yes. Won't that be? Isn't that smart? But actually, it turned out, and this is one of those good stories from publishing that I think still happen, and times haven't changed quite that much. I mean, this was the early 80s. I had about 100 pages of that first novel, and said we were living in Manhattan in student housing, and Mark Smith, who was a novelist I'd studied with at the University of New Hampshire, was in town, and he took us out to dinner, and I mentioned that I was working on a novel, and he said, well, then you need to have an agent. And I said, no. And he said, there's a woman named Harriet Wasserman, who's a wonderful agent, and I'll write her a letter, but once I write her this letter, you have to contact her, that nudge.
Right.
So I later learned that he wrote a letter that said, you are going to kiss my feet in Macy's window for the young writer I'm about to send you.
Nice. Very nice.
So I was stuck. I literally walked down to her office in Midtown with my 100 pages.
You hadn't
It was
finished.
all I had.
Yes.
I had 100 pages. I didn't really know what I was doing. And I literally slipped them under the door and ran away, with the whole idea, well, she can read them, and then if she just doesn't call me,
it won't be awkward.
It wouldn't be awkward, right. She did call me, and she said, well, my first question is, do you want to work with a male editor or a female
Really?
editor?
Interesting. I don't think anyone would ask that today, do you?
No, probably not. Probably not. And I said, even an illiterate editor would be fine. Within a week, she had sold those 100
Just from the
pages to Jonathan Galassi, who has been my editor all these years. He had just been made senior editor at Houghton Mifflin. And I actually had an advance that allowed me to work another 6 months just as a writer.
That's great. That's great. It's something of a cliche that great writers are born of troubled families. I get a lot of wry sorrow from your fiction, but I don't think you're writing from some traumatic childhood, are you?
No, well, maybe that's a lack. Right. I'll have to take this up with my mother.
See what she can do retroactively.
Yes, exactly, right. Yeah, she's working on it. No, I had a conversation once with Edna O'Brien, and she was talking about, the reaction that she had in Ireland and within her family to her first novel. And I remember, and she's told the story many times, but she was telling me how her mother not only took the book and took a black pen and blacked out all the sections that she didn't approve of. When she had finished doing that, that wasn't enough. She then took the book with all the sections blacked out and buried it.
Buried it in the
buried
ground?
it in the ground.
Wow. Like a little ceremony.
Yes, exactly. Which, and after she was telling me this, and it was so harrowing, and it was so and I just turned to her and I said, you know what, Edna? I would have given anything to have been taken that seriously by my parents and the people I know. To have upset them that much would have meant so much more than Alice is writing novels.
How quaint.
How quaint, right?
She could have been a nurse or a school teacher.
Right, exactly, right. We really would have preferred if she'd been a secretary, but she seems to be making a living, and she's teaching, which is respectable. So, sometimes I a little bit of passion in people's response to your passion might be helpful. But I also had the freedom to write what I wanted to.
Right, right. The characters in your novels are frequently looking back. You agree?
Yes.
They're
Yes.
retrospective people.
Yes.
There's a lot of nostalgia. They're either trapped or entranced by the past in some way. What draws you to that theme of retrospection?
Well, I suppose it's, at heart, it's an overriding sense of mortality, that it's all fleeting. And along with that, since a lot of my characters tend to be Irish American, recently arrived, or first generation, there is that sense of exile, the sense of having lost what was, that is in some way unattainable. But I think it's just that more than that is that overriding sense of what time does to all of us.
You frequently write about Irish Catholics. You're Irish Catholic, right? Are you self-conscious about that autobiographical impulse? Or are we making too many connections between the creator and her creation? I'm sure you get asked at readings all the time how much of this is true.
Yes. Oh, of course. Right.
It's not.
Right.
There isn't. Right? You're not writing about yourself.
No, from the very beginning, I was making up autobiographical essays because I have no material. I provide myself with absolutely no material. I have the dullest, most ordinary life, and have had.
You're married to the same man.
Yes.
You
yeah.
have three
yeah.
healthy children.
Yes, exactly, and in the suburbs, and a great dog. That whole thing. It's. I guess in some ways it's been an advantage because being termed that Irish American gives people access to your work.
Right.
Oh, you're Irish, you would like this.
Right.
But it's never anything I ever intended. For me, those details of the story are only the details that what I'm trying to write about and what I'm trying to figure out for my characters. Is how do we live in time? How do we live with this overwhelming awareness of our mortality? How do we reconcile loss?
Either in the past or approaching.
Exactly. The inevitability of it, which for me is the overriding issue of to be human. The details come from the material that's at hand for me,
which happens to be
that milieu. I know how Irish Americans speak. I know, and the other thing they provide me with is that Catholicism also provides a language for that kind of discussion about time, about how are we redeemed. In the face of inevitable loss. But what is redeemed? What saves us?
I want to talk about your faith and the faith in the book. But first, could you read a passage? Do you have something picked out from After This?
Yeah, this is...
Explain the title, too, if you could.
The title of this novel comes actually from a Catholic prayer, the Salve Regina. And the line of the prayer is, and after this, our exile, show unto us the blessed fruit of thy womb. After this, our exile. Again, so it's that sense of that we are all in some way exiles. And when we get through that, then what are we looking for? The book, in many ways, is about the Catholic Church in the decades that the book follows, which is post World War II to Vietnam, and so just tracing those changes in the church through a single family. Again, not so much. I'm not a sociologist, and I'm not terribly interested in the permutations of the bureaucracy of my church, but as a parallel, a kind of yearning, a kind of getting it right, doing it over and getting it right. How do we say that an attempt to say what can't be said.
Okay.
And here in the middle of the novel is a piece about the physical changes to the structure of the church where the Keene family attend Mass. The church had gone to pot. It had gone to seed. It had been minimally repaired for the last 5 years, and come Monday, the dismantling would begin. Any parishioner wishing to purchase one of the old pews should have already called the rectory. There were shingles missing from the exterior. The bell, for safety's sake, had long ago been removed from the belfry. The green canvas awning that had once shaded the entrance and the tall brick steps that led from the street had been torn in the '60 hurricane and never repaired. In 1964, it was taken down altogether, and now only the metal frame remained, a crisscross of bare ironwork against the sky. The choir loft, also for safety's sakes, had been off limits for as long as most of the children in the school could remember. A rumor spread among the younger ones, Claire Keene included, that the unused staircase at the back of the church, with its wide marble banister and its velvet rope, and its scent, when you got near it, of incest and attics, was an entrance to heaven. The painting across the high ceiling of John the Baptist pouring water from his palm over the head of a beautiful Christ was itself marred by water. There was a misshapen, ominously gray cloud in the blue sky above their heads, another stretched across the saint's feet and over the Savior's knees. The stained glass window high above the altar, St. Gabriel with his halo and his wings, also leaked. On a bad day, the water ran down the wall and over the crucifix and behind the gold tabernacle. The filigree on the old altar had chipped away. No one remembered the last time the organ had actually played. On the Friday before the last Sunday, all the children in the school were led into the church for a farewell prayer. And just as Father Hecht said, "The old makes way for the new," Marilyn Giovanni in the 5th grade slammed the back of her head into the back of the pew with an echoing, inhuman cry, rolled onto the worn carpet of the center aisle. It was an epileptic seizure. Mrs. Ryan, who taught the 3rd grade, had an afflicted child of her own and knew just what to do. And superstition in this day and age was well to be avoided. But the Bible itself was full of misdiagnoses, and who could help but wonder what it was the devil would have objected to, the old or the new? Was it protest that made him seize the little girl at that moment, or celebration?
It's a great scene. A great scene. It seems to me that we talk about everything in fiction now, the most intimate things, but the last taboo is faith.
Yes.
It just doesn't show up that much. When you think of the number of Americans who go to church every day, who read the Bible, who pray every day, if you read literary novels, you would have no idea. It's just, frankly, written out of our literary fiction. Not in yours. Do you have a sense of that? Do you have a sense that you're doing something a little a little unusual to write about religion and religious people in a very ordinary way? That you're not writing about priest abuse, you're not writing about fanatics, you're writing about the ordinary experience of faith.
Yeah, you know, my primary intention is to get these characters who come to me through the writing right. To get them on the page authentically and honestly. If for a minute I felt I was there first and foremost to say something about religion,
yes,
or defend it or tear it down, my fiction would be sunk. But in order to know these characters, I have to give full credit to their beliefs and to their inner lives. And again, especially for many of the dyed-in-the-wool Catholics, their inner lives, the language with which they speak to themselves,
right,
more often than not, has been given to them by their faith. That prayer is the same thing as talking to yourself, not in that we're all alone sort of way, but in the most intimate way.
Right.
and I could not separate the two, and I would never want to use that to make some larger point. I just simply want to be able to authentically, through language, reproduce the experience of these people in their time and place.
Which you know from some personal experience. In other words, you pray.
Yes.
You believe.
And in some ways, I think, you know, and this becomes the difference between autobiographical writing and writing fiction.
Right.
And so much I have to say is I don't know, but I learn that I intuit. Mm-hmm. And I learn that, again, through the working at words. It's one of the hardest things to convey to young fiction writers, is to trust what will be revealed to them mm-hmm. through the hard work of getting the language right.
Even to use a phrase, to be revealed. I mean, it's a religious phrase.
Yes.
Does writing have some sort of spiritual significance to you? Not to be grandiose, but
yes.
Does it?
It gives meaning, you know, in a way, or at least it helps, that same seeking of meaning that mm-hmm. I think all of us, in various ways, are about. But for me, writing fiction is my way of seeking meaning. And so again, it's very much akin to what goes on in church and,
right.
and what prayer is all about.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about plot. Imagine a spectrum of plot. At one end is Tom Clancy, all action. At the other end is the late Irish writer John McGahern. Nothing happens.
Yes.
Where are you in that spectrum?
Probably more nothing happens, much to my editor's dismay. I did have a conversation with Jonathan once when I wanted to cut something out of one of my novels, and he wanted me to keep it in, and he said, "Alice, something has to happen." Oh, but it's too much. It's too much.
Sometimes I get the feeling nothing's happening, but the things are happening. And I realize it later, and I understand more about what's going on in your fiction. But as you conceive of a novel, do you conceive of it in terms of plot or in terms of characters? Does it come to you as an action?
You know, it's different every time. Mm-hmm. You know, often it is an action, but you know, there's no action without character,
right.
and vice versa. There's no character without some action.
But you know there are authors who conceive of a plot without characters.
Yes, yeah.
Thriller
right.
writers, etc.
Yeah, sure. And you'll read them and you won't find a character anywhere. You know, they're moving, and sometimes I say to my students, you know, not to be highfalutin, but you know, there are lots of people who love pictures of Elvis on velvet, and
yes.
it takes a certain amount of skill to do a good picture of Elvis on velvet.
Yes.
And I take nothing away from the artist or the people who, but we're talking about something entirely different here, and one should not exclude the other because they both involve books and people reading
right.
Them. But if you know, we are inundated with story, good stories.
Yes.
You know, journalists have borrowed enough in the past 30 years from
yes.
fiction writers that you know, almost every article in the Post now begins with a scene, you know,
true.
and a character,
yes.
And an individual. So what's left for fiction to do? You know, and it seems to me that's where the primacy of language comes in. The language as a vehicle for the mystery writer, for the journalist, is one thing. Language as the primary benefit, the primary gift, is something that still the poets and the fiction writers can claim.
So you start with voice, not character or plot.
Very much so. Very much so. For me, it's about the pleasure of word. The writers I love
yes.
are not so much the writers that tell a great story, although a great story is, we all love a great story. We're hardwired to love great stories.
Who are the living writers you love? Because when I ask, usually everyone picks old people. Right, nobody
all
cares.
Those dead
I
like
love
guys.
Joyce. Well,
Right,
who doesn't?
yeah.
But who are the living writers
Joyce.
you like?
Well, when I think about use of language, I think of Toni Morrison, you know, and the remarkable things that she does with language. And it's indefinable, you
yes.
know? I mean, you have to, it's that sort of thing. You can't tell someone about it. You have to say, just read that paragraph.
Right.
I was trying to sell her to a group of graduate students just a year or so ago who were really resisting. And all I found myself doing was just reading out loud. Just stop and read that paragraph and see what goes on here.
She's fairly experimental now.
Yes, yes.
You're
yeah.
not.
Not yet. It may come to that. Well, you know, this is where autobiography does come in, and always at my back I hear, "Who do you think you are?"
Oh, really?
You know? And that's the, you know, for goodness sake, who are you writing for? And nobody understands. You know, that's okay for Joyce,
Right. Toni Morrison.
and Toni Morrison. But you know, there's also that sense of speak plainly, please. And I do struggle with that.
When you're teaching your students, some of them probably write very experimental things.
Yes, less and less so.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Really?
yeah.
You've been teaching how long now?
Oh my goodness.
So you've been teaching
Years.
long enough to see some trends, some change.
Yes, yes.
And you're seeing students turn away from that?
Yes, yeah. I think, I don't know if it's commerce in here.
The pressure of trying to sell things?
Yes,
They get a
yes.
sense that it's not what the market wants?
Yeah. I mean, they'll do a kind of experimentation, but it's not that kind of radical, you know, imitators of John Barth, who we used to have a lot of
Yes.
at Hopkins.
Yes.
You don't see that, or I don't see that quite so much anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Ron.
I'm Ron Charles. This has been Hoko Palizzo's The Writing Life with Alice McDermott.